while I talk about the influence of social media, I'll share my personal experience by using it. And it started about, I think, 7 years ago. If you still remember, back then we didn't use a lot of Facebook. Instagram wasn't there, nor was Twitter a thing. A lot of us used MySpace, or some even used Friendster and MSN. There was a time when I was first introduced to the world of social media and online communication. At that point in time, the influence of social media wasn't as pervasive as it is today. Those were the days where social media was predominantly used, especially by young people like me, to either communicate, but communication in a way in which, to get dates and to have conversations with people of the opposite sex. It wasn't that formalized. The influence wasn't that pervasive. But fast forward to today, social media has led to the shifting in democracies across the world, to the loosening of attitudes, to cultural changes in ways which we could never foresee it to be. For example, I remember one of my first experiences in politics and my first exposure in politics was also due to social media. Initially, I was merely a special officer to one of the ministers, and it was a time of crisis when corruption was rife, and I decided to speak up. But I know merely speaking up through my words or just through mere writing would be insufficient, especially when we had a lot of government censorship before, which meant that my ideas and thoughts couldn't be ventilated in ways which it could be today. So what I did was, one of the easiest ways to circumvent any form of censorship, as any other young person, is to take it on Facebook. And when I did that, unexpectedly, the news went viral. It was picked up by multiple different news agencies, locally and internationally. At the same time, it was reported by a lot of the news portals, despite being censored by the mainstream media. From there onward, my life changed almost completely. I lost my job as a part-time lecturer, as a researcher for the Johor State Government. My students in IIUM were threatened. But the level of threat levied against dissidents is indicative of how strong and powerful social media can be in Malaysia and the global community today. That mere words which you type on Facebook and Twitter can define policies, can define the future of that very nation. And it wasn't just about me. It's about the larger community. When there are unique, subjective, artistic campaigns ran by people like Fahmi Reza, despite it being very controversial, portraying clownish images of the current Prime Minister and also former Prime Ministers and multiple different politicians. But it is the usage of social media which led to that message being received by different communities. At the same time, we see loosening of dictatorships through the usage of social media. I remember reading up with research about the loosening of Eastern Europe in the 1970s and 1980s, post-Soviet Union. The Orange, Velvet and Rose Revolution started up at that point in time because of fax machines, because of printing machines, because despite the non-existence of social media, but because people could print out materials and send them to multiple different groups, that unique message communicator then led to a whole movement, a movement which was very inclusive, a movement which then led to the loosening of Eastern Europe and the opening up of democratic spaces in Eastern Europe. And that was before, even without social media. But with social media today, it's much, much easier. You don't need to buy expensive equipment like fax machines in the 1970s and 1980s. At the same time, you don't need to go through immense bureaucratic barriers because it merely requires a tweet or Facebook message or Facebook post for that message to be reached out. And today we see that culture becoming a lot more prevalent in Malaysia and in a highly globalized community. I distinctly also remember reading about the loosening of the Arab League or the Arab Spring, which was sparked due to the influence of social media. All of this points to one thing. In a highly globalized world, in a world in which technology is becoming more pervasive, social media is indeed a unique disruptor. If corporations do not innovate with it and integrate it, then they're very likely to go bust. If individuals, whether they are students or graduates, do not master it, they are more likely to have skills which will be outdated. It is something which affects our lives in multiple different ways, not just in the opening up of democratic spheres, but also in using it as unique education tools, in using it as communication tools towards communities or groups which couldn't be reached before, or which would take a very high cost barrier to reach to them. But while we have that in mind, how do we best move forward? Which links back to the question which I'm asked to look at. The youth involvement in social media and identifying the right balance between social media and in terms of its uniqueness and pervasiveness, and how do we not get too addicted to it. I mean, in Malaysia, in the last report which I read, on average Malaysians spend about 5 to 6 hours on social media. If you think about it, that's a lot of time. If you work in office about 8 hours a day, most in Malaysia will work for at times 12 hours or 11 hours a day. But imagine almost half the time, at times more, 6 hours of that time, dedicated on social media. In Bangkok, it's worse, it goes up to 8 hours. It's either people dedicated on Facebook, Twitter, on Instagram, or spend a lot of time watching Netflix or YouTube. It is a very big part of our life. And from there onward, how do we move forward? Some governments have taken the move to restrict social media, to restrict the freedom of information, and they use multiple different ways. For example, the introduction of the anti-fake news bill, or even previously, what's uniquely and notoriously coined as Akta Sakit Hati. Because when a particular person receives an emotionally charged criticism and might be offended, that can be used to incarcerate or imprison the dissident. However, the way in which we move forward is not to censor opinions, because it's worse. As a government, or as a group, or as a corporation, we need to know what our employees think. We need to know what the rakyat wants. We also need to know how our product placement is like. As a consequence, merely censoring it will lead to greater harms, because in the end, it's either that discussion will work in an unregulated atmosphere, or in a way in which that discussion, which might be beneficial and positive, which will lead to good feedback, will not reach the government quarters and agencies which it could have. The way forward, and this is my personal belief, and I believe it's something which I share with fellow cabinet ministers and new government of the day, is that the best way is not to restrict, it's not to censor, but it's to open up democratic spaces and spheres, and to engage with it directly. Because when we engage with them, we know what the problems are. When we engage despite the fact that there might be fake news out there, but when we defend ourselves, or we provide a counter-narrative, people then can judge which narrative is correct, which one is true, which one is factually accurate, and which one is factually inaccurate. It's best that we leave the power to decide in the hands of our intellectual citizenry than to make an arbitrary decision by ourselves and a small group of elites on what's right and what's wrong, what can be accepted and what cannot, what's sensitive and what's not. The way forward, I believe, for Malaysia is to open up multiple different democratic spaces and atmosphere, so that by then we can self-criticize and self-evaluate, we can know how do we move forward as a society, we can think deeply on what cultural shifts do we want, what is our Malaysian identity, what are the kind of policies we should like to formulate together. Because social media as a disruptor, as a tool of innovation, uniquely reaches out to the masses in ways which we could never do before. And with that, I also like to share another story. I apologize, a lot of my stories at times can be quite political or linked to international relations, because I lectured on IR before, and also now I'm in politics, so Obviously, there'll be some political examples. I remember about 1 year or 1 year and a half ago, when I helped Tun Dr. Mahathir manage his social media. I remember looking at Dato Sri Najib as a benchmark at that point in time, because he had like, I don't know, 3 million followers or something. At the same time, when Tun first started, he had 0.